Now that Victor had rested, recovered, and obtained his new arsenal, it was time to finally begin exploring, well, the outside world, if one could even consider it a world at this point. Basim's words echoing in the background. Now, he had spent quite a bit of time around here, but he had yet to actually get inside one of these rooms. It was locked. According to the journals, it was a zoo of some sort. Honestly, Victor wasn't too concerned about getting inside. There was probably nothing but unsavory experiments and creatures within. Despite this, it was on his to-do list if he ever managed to locate the key. Truthfully, he hadn't scrounged the entire estate, as it were, as much as he could have. He'd been more concerned with more selfish desires, specifically his own survival. For now, he felt comfortable attempting to explore the outside world of this plane, though he was a bit wary. From the information he'd gathered, several of his original spells would simply not work here. It was inconclusive in regards to a couple, and so he needed to test it. It was as simple as that. The estate didn't have a training grounds, as it were, so this was the best he had. Luckily, summoning spells at the very least were still very usable, though spells such as Fireball and other evocational spells struggled. There was a chance of failure and backfire. Nonetheless, it was an excellent chance to test out his new staff. And it seemed to have worked. Including the summoning abilities of that lamp had been quite useful. An air elemental at that. Stepping up to the door. Beyond this door lies the Darklands, an endless sea of shifting shadows. Do you wish to enter the Darklands? And of course, Victor will take that first step, for better or worse at this point. Not exactly what Victor was imagining, though this pitch-black darkness is definitely fitting. And if Victor didn't have the enchantment on his armor that produced light, he might actually be in quite a bit of trouble here. Even with the blessing. Well, it seemed it was time to test out the staff in full. Well, it seemed the practice with the staff as well as the enchantments had paid off. His body had actually gotten much stronger than he'd initially thought. Then again, that entire situation he'd been fighting on low blood, struggling, and frankly had not been enjoying his time. It seemed shadows themselves came to life in this place. They did appear to be spirits or undead of some sort, however, because the enchantment of his staff still worked on them. Refocusing. The deep darkness was suspicious, to put it lightly. Even the enchantments of his clothing that produced light didn't pierce the inky depths before him. It'd be better to avoid them. Nothing good could come of stepping on them, especially with such suspicious rings wrapped around them. So, making a mental note to avoid any of these pits as best he can. Oh, well. He was certainly correct. The tracks are curious, but this portal is what caught his attention. This is a shadow portal, a planar rift within the shadow plane that can move you to nearby places on that plane. The more you use these portals, the more you acclimate your will to them, allowing you to control their destination. Luckily, Victor was able to read up on these portals beforehand. The Shadow Lich had made great use of them. You wish to travel to a different area. As tempting as it is, after all, with repeated use, it should be much more easy to travel these planes. But for now, he will examine the area. Unfortunately, it looks like he's trapped himself, yes, on a dead end. Which means he will have to traverse over this darkness again. It seems the plane itself wants to kill you. Ugh. Well, clearly those tracks were some unfortunate soul that was sucked into the darkness. Exploring this place was going to be more dangerous than he'd assumed. As the temperature dropped and the darkness became even thicker, Victor had to squint even in the light that he produced just to see a few feet ahead of him. The temple of some sort? Certainly what it appeared to be. And suddenly rocks would fall. Was the plane itself crumbling constantly? Somehow, having avoided the damage, Victor had to think back. The books that the Shadow Lich had provided were many. He had studied numerous tomes, but there was no way he could learn all the secrets of this plane so quickly. With a theory, it would be that most likely due to the plane's nature of constantly mixing in and out of the other planes, it caused some instability. Hopefully that instability wouldn't lead to his death. Now, he could stoop under this ledge and enter. There might be something worthwhile inside. And it appeared to be a tunnel that led out into a different area of the Darklands. Even the water was like ink. The mushrooms that provided minimal light barely gave anything for visual connection. Hesitant to step in the dark liquid, but without much other choice, Victor would carefully try to make his way through. And thankfully, it appeared the inky liquid, though it certainly didn't look appealing, was relatively harmless. More wells of that deep darkness, and a skeleton? It was hard to make out exactly what. Another portal. How could he get over there? Perhaps there was a connection on this side? No. Well, it appeared he was going to be playing hopscotch across some of these stones. Not there. So just a completely different direction from the original tower, it would seem. And apparently a bunch of Shadowvar suddenly appeared. They didn't appear hostile. Were they dipping in and out of the realm? It was difficult to say. Well, if they didn't intend to attack, he certainly wouldn't be punishing them for it. The fact they appeared like that was worrying. Then again, this place was of chaos. And then there was a spectral panther of some sort, fading in and out in the distance, and it was certainly a non-hostile skeleton by the looks of it. Well, now was as good a time as any, perhaps, to test some of these spells. He hadn't been certain about magic missile. Pointless. He would have to replace them with something else in that case. He already knew that acid worked well. Now, magic missile didn't work, but it appeared a stronger variation of it still did. That was excellent to know. More Shadow Var. That was concerning, to say the least. More of the Panthers were in this direction. Right then. Well, the next step. He didn't want to waste these wands on tests if he could avoid it. For now, to get their attention. Thankfully, they didn't appear to be nearly as dangerous as he'd assumed. He might be able to engage in physical confrontation with them. And with the staff's help, he was managing just that. He had to think back on Drogon's old lessons, where the old dwarf had beat him over the head with a cane when he'd been trying to use a sword. If the old dwarf could see him now, rummaging about in the shadow plane of all places. Those Shadow Var were making him very nervous. The more that gathered, the more likely they were to attack, especially with their previous encounters. But for now, he wanted to see if the skeleton was capable of communication. The skeleton moans and continues to shamble across the Darklands. Oblivious to you or your surroundings, he mumbles to himself softly. Victor would, of course, attempt to get some form of communication out of him, trying to ask who exactly the skeleton was. The skeleton turns its head upon a dried, cracked spine, looking in Victor's direction, and then finally speaks. Fallen light, upon this ground I fell, left to rot and cast out. My arms stripped, and my soul cast to the hells, twisted, failed, and disgraced. Victor, of course, would take this to mean that, more than likely, by arms, judging by the armor he wears, he means a weapon of some sort. Soul cast out, so he failed in some way and was cast into the shadow plane? But that didn't make sense. What? The shadow plane was not part of the Nine Hells. It was a space outside its own, outside the bubble, as one could reference it, of the normal planes. It was what lay in between. That was very confusing. The skeleton was likely not educated in these means, especially after death for so long, though. To it, this may very well be hell. So, Victor instead would move on. How are you disgraced? The skeleton lets loose an unearthly howl. She lured me from my post in the place where darkness festers. She. Well, this was just a guess, and there could be millions of she's. But luring him into the darkness made Victor think of the shadow woman that had appeared before him. Perhaps a connection? What arms did you lose? What weapon? The skeleton breathes words from his skeletal mouth as if wind through a valley. My weapon, twisted to another's will, must be retrieved and cleansed, else my soul I am to wander for all time. His method of speech made it clear he was from a very, very bygone era, though the rusted armor made that very clear as well. This weapon, do you know where it is? Can it, and how exactly, can it be cleansed? It must be dipped in water pure. It must be cleansed and returned to the temple for my soul to be freed. And with that, the skeleton wandered off and stared aimlessly into the darkness once more. Clearly, its mind had deteriorated quite a bit. But perhaps he'd be able to help out the old soldier. Unfortunately, it wasn't high on his priorities list, but if he stumbled upon this weapon of his... And now, Victor was faced with a very different choice. These Shadowvar were clearly the same as the ones that had manifested and attacked him in cold blood. They were not in the estate, so they clearly did not serve him. How long had it been? He had to wonder. Since his time in Drogon's care, the Victor of that time would have done everything he could to keep hostile interactions at a minimum, try to befriend them. But the Victor that stood wreathed in shadow, looking at these cold eyes of men and women that he knew had slaughtered others, felt no desire to keep peace with them, and felt only suspicion. Frankly, he could not take the risk, especially as more and more continued to gather. If there became too many, he would not survive if they turned hostile. And he had every belief that they would. His decision made, he stepped forward to end it. Before it began. They were slow to respond, and then they were not, and it became very clear they had no issue at all with attacking him. Whatever ambush they'd intended to set up was not going to pass, although the way they acted, it was almost as though they weren't even sentient. They seemed confused and drowned in the darkness, almost as if they weren't real? Were these Shadowvar just echoes? Trapped souls of those that he'd already killed? He wasn't certain anymore. But either way, he knew he couldn't take the risk. They needed to be cut down. If they were echoes, then they should probably thank him for no longer being trapped within this dimension. And well, if they did actually intend to do him harm, he'd stopped it before it could initiate. Resigned to his decision, he made a mental note that any that he ran across from now on he would have to cut down. There was no going halfway on these things. And the more they acted, the more he almost felt as though he was truly doing them a favor. Perhaps this place was changing him more than he liked. stepping around the deep darkness once more. And it seemed rocks continued to fall. It must be a relatively... Damn it. More shadows. Luckily, these were not too big of a threat, although they were a bit difficult to hit at times. Luckily, the elemental was making relatively short work of them, all things considered. With more rocks falling, it seemed to solidify his hypothesis that... Damn, more shadow fall. Solidify the hypothesis of... And with their mirrored aggression, it was very clear that not all of them were like echoes. Desperate to try to cut them down now, he had to mentally thank all his enchantments for reflecting the effects of these spells. Low-level mages were no longer of any concern. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He couldn't take the entire risk. Anything could kill you if you didn't try hard enough or underestimated them too far. Yeah, more stones. Even as they died, they just faded into shadow. Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. If you'd like to see future content, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification icon. If you'd like access to bonus content, such as special privileges on my personal Discord, extra information on my stories and world building, or perhaps simply wish to support my work here, please consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you for all your time, and I can't wait to see you in the next chapter of our story.